Welcome to Serenity Rising, Healing with Cancer. I'm Bron and I want to welcome you to not just a podcast, but to a community, a new way of seeing, feeling and walking through the chaos of cancer. So my guest today didn't come to this community because he had cancer. He came because he lost someone to it. And what he did with that loss is one of the most extraordinary things I've encountered in building this podcast. Justin Anderson is a network engineer from Muncie, Indiana, and he's writing as J. Vaelorin. He's also the founder of Vaelorin Verse, a dark fantasy universe built, in his own words, from grief that had nowhere else to live. His grandmother was the first person to hold him when he was born. When she died of cancer, Justin refused to let anyone else carry her casket. He wanted to be one of the last people to carry her out of this world. He designed her tombstone himself. He wrote the inscription, "Those who are loved will never be forgotten." Now that line is now carved into stone. It's tattooed on his arm, and it lives across everything he builds, from a spoken word campaign about mental health to an apparel brand for caretakers and first responders, to an anonymous online memorial wall where anyone can leave the name of someone they've lost. Justin is here today for the carers, the family members, the people in the waiting room, the ones who are already grieving and who are filled with a little bit of fear. So Justin, welcome to Serenity Rising. So good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Thank you. All right, so let's get stuck into it. Let's start with the tombstone. So you designed your grandmother's tombstone and wrote the quote carved into it yourself. Tell me about that decision and how that imagery and that line connect everything that you're building now.
Well, it wasn't the actual plan for me to do it. I kind of learned in that moment what would later be kind of a talent for building lines and building script, just things that stick with people. Originally, my mother was kind of started the process, but she didn't know what to put, of course, grieving her mother. Yes. And the only thing they could really think of, my mother and my sister was there. And my sister was like, well, let's put a fishing pole. She liked fishing. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it looks so ugly. And I was just like, I know she likes fishing, but this doesn't speak to me. This doesn't, it wasn't feeling like in my mind that was enough to honor my grandmother. And as we scrolled through the images, there was a heart with a rose there, and that was the first piece. And then, I knew my grandmother was a church member. So then the praying hands was also added.
Right.
And as we discussed what to put on there, we went round and round. The saying just popped into my head of those who are loved would never be forgotten. And that felt perfect because I knew that she would be someone that I would never forget, nor would my mother or my sister. And that's how it came about. And when I said it, even the person assisting with creating the tombstone felt like that was done. Everything we needed to put on there, the saying, the imagery, it was perfect.
So when you actually did that, what did you think it did for you being able to make those sort of decisions? And you were gifted that, it came to you. That's obviously your strength. How did you then build on that saying? Because obviously it's part of who you are now.
That became the thing that I carried forward because, we're taught a lot of time when it comes to grief that death is kind of the end all be all. And that's you just kind of let people go and you just see them again later on. And that didn't really sit well with me because I felt like even from that moment, my grandmother was still guiding me in very much a part that, very much a presence in my life to help me make certain decisions. And it became kind of a road I traveled, almost like, the saying of what would Jesus do? It became the decision that I used to honor her, the choices I made. And as I start seeing other people kind of experience this grief, because normally when you're in the grief of someone dying from cancer or, who has cancer, you feel very alone. And it became a saying that I kind of passed along. And now it's just part of my whole universe that I built for other people to be able to be witnessed and to be able to have somewhere to put their grief, like a shelter.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And, before we got on the call, guys, our listeners here, we were talking about, which is the one question I ask everybody, is obviously everybody knows that my word for serenity is serenity, meaning that moment in time, which is that's my space of being so grounded to where I am, which is, be where my feet are. And I think this fits so beautifully to the word that you've chosen to share. So, Justin, can you share what's your version of serenity?
Mine is connections, and the connection to, people, even to my own grief, my grandmother, my family, my friends, and environment, my faith and things is grounded in that center word. And, as you asked me that question and I pondered over it because I wasn't sure what to say. Now it's like I can see it. And in my world, the threads connect everyone. So it ties back to what you asked me. The word is connection. That's the word for me.
I love that. And thank you, because I know it was sort of a left-hand question. So thank you. And I love that because, I think that says it all with your saying and how you've now developed that into something so much bigger for other people going through grief. Now, I want to ask you a question, which is, you said your grandmother was uncertain whether you would graduate.
Yes.
When she died, and that uncertainty actually became your motivation, because most people would carry that as guilt, but you carried it as fuel. So how did that turn happen for you?
I spent my high school, like most teenagers, I always felt I had another year to get the grades right. It was like, well, I'm doing bad this year, but I got another year. I'll fix it then. I'll just study twice as hard. You start doing almost like the math twice as hard, 3 times as hard.
Yes.
My grandmother, she would stay on me, and I was like, well, I'll just do it twice as hard. And when she got sick, I remember her, saying to me, I hope you graduate. And, that uncertainty, it rattled me in that moment, because in that moment, I honestly kind of thought, I was like, well, I should be fine. And by the end of that year, I saw it was like, okay, I'm dancing really on the edge of this. Like, I may not. And going through that time, which later on I know, now it was depression. I was going through those emotions and I didn't really know what I was dealing with. And as a male who grew up in the 90s, I was geared towards that old stereotype that males can't be vulnerable, that they can't be weak, that we have to be tough. And if you didn't have a male in the house, that it didn't matter your age, you were the man of the house. So I'm suppressing all that grief, all that depression. Huge. And I was just angry all the time. And my grandmother passing really shake my mind a little bit, because now I knew that when she passed that she still was uncertain. And I was like, if I do nothing else, I want to make sure that she can smile down on me and say, you did it. And that journey, honestly, was a rough one. It was a rough one for multiple reasons. It was a rough one because it was a adjustment in my mindset around not being angry and kind of letting myself feel somewhat. But I also had some moments in school that were really bad. I had a couple teachers that were racist, and they were failing me, not rightfully so, but that affected my grade. And as again, I've healed, but I was so angry, and I remember this because to this day, I will be honest, I still ended up with an F in government, which was a requirement to pass. And my counselor, I remember speaking with him because I had a teacher and he knew about the situation. So he talked to me. And the lucky thing, I guess, about being depressed is that I just threw everything in my locker. Every piece of paper I got graded, I threw in my locker, and it was just like, didn't care to throw it away. He told me, and I wasn't, getting A's and B's. I was like right there at like a plus C minus area, enough to where I should have passed, but it was still low. And he asked me about it. He was like, "You realize you're failing right now?" And I'm like, "Well, we graded the papers," and I'm like, "I shouldn't be failing. Now I'm not saying I'm A and B, but I should at least have a D." And he was like, "No." And I seen the look on his face, and it was puzzling for him. And he was like, "You don't have any grades for the second semester." And I'm like, "Well, I got all these papers graded in my locker again." And that was just happened to be luck that I didn't throw them away, because typically I would. And
goodness.
Yes. Now,
that's
again,
not cool.
I was extremely angry then.
I bet.
I did have a conversation with the teacher and with him, and I think that conversation probably made him concerned that I would have did so. And I won't lie. In that moment, I probably would have done something that would have kept me from talking to you on air to this day if I honestly would have failed. And I remember telling the teacher.
I'm glad you didn't go there. I'm glad you didn't go there.
Yeah, but I told the teacher.
I bet you did. Anyway, we will move on from that bit. But what I'm interested in is that at some stage, you had a choice in the road. And I talk about this when things happen, when adversity hits you, it's literally there's a choice in that moment. Now, you made that choice to back yourself versus do something you shouldn't have. So
Correct.
Can you walk me through a little bit about how did that happen in terms of the choice in the road? It's very important, actually.
The choice in the road, as much as I felt slighted, I did understand, there was a part of me that still understood that wouldn't resolve anything for me long term. I may have felt some sort of, and I'm assuming, again, I couldn't even tell you really if it would have went down the worst path. I would have even felt happy during or anything.
No, that's right.
Assuming that I would have felt a slight peace of mind, but that means giving up any and every possibility of keeping that promise to my grandmother. And in that moment, and still to this day, I would say, there would have been nothing that they could have done that would have been worth it to giving up and breaking that promise to her. Nor would I have been able to probably forgive myself for breaking that promise over something like that.
Yeah.
There was very many ways. And I think I was blessed to be young like I was and go through a lot of adversities that allowed me to critically think. And, there's a lot of times where it doesn't seem like there's a different path, but there's honestly is. And
there always is.
And I was able to figure out those ways. For one of the teachers, I talked to the next grade, the 10th grade gym teacher, and I asked him if I could take his class to replace my 9th grade credit. And then I basically did all the legwork. So when, they came to the counselor and was like, "Well, we can't do that. I've already cleared all this." He said, "It's okay. All I need you to do is sign off on it." And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is if you bring something to someone and they have to put very little effort in to say yes, a lot of times they will say yes.
Yeah.
So thinking around, like I said, thinking around that issue, it just wasn't worth that promise that I made to her to
That's right.
graduate.
And you held that, I mean, as you say, you've held that through your whole life. Now,
Yes.
what I would love to talk about next is what would you say to someone who's listening right now who is in that anticipatory grief? So who's already losing someone or they're fearful that they're going to lose someone. So I want to keep it to the side of you've got that vortex of fear, as I call it. We're walking around the vortex of fear. What would you say to someone who's listening to this podcast right now?
I would say, number one, it's okay to feel grief, to feel afraid, and honestly, it's okay that you may feel alone, that you feel these heavy emotions because, I mean, they're really there. And there's a big difference for people, and hopefully society kind of realizes it more often going forward. But there's a difference when you're losing someone and someone who passed. Someone who passed is a little bit, you're able to cope with it. There's an ending in some case, but when you're losing someone or anticipating the loss, you're mourning someone with no funeral. And that has a whole different feel because you are losing someone because you're losing the version of that person that you will never get to meet. And I think that's important for someone to understand that you are going through, in a sense, a loss, because I had a vision of my grandmother holding my first child, talking to my children, being there for my marriage. So that vision and that version of her being how she was, I lost that version and I needed to grieve that version. But the hardest part about going through lost in that way is that since there's no funeral, there's no mourning, there's none of that, people treat it differently. They don't really see, unless you've been through it, other people don't tend to see that weight and that gravity of what you're carrying and the grief that's there. So my biggest thing to say to that person is, with podcasts like yours and other people in, my work and things, we see you. You are seeing your grief, your pain, your fear is witnessed. And, that would be one of the things I would want them to know. You aren't alone. You are here with other people who can sit here with you in that vortex, as you said, can sit within that vortex, that storm with you. And when you're ready and when you've processed it enough to move forward, we'll walk with you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, my experience, both as a nursing educator and obviously now as a participant of this journey, I feel the biggest thing when it comes to the grief is to make sure, this is why the book's called Be Where Your Feet Are, is to stay here. Because it's so easy to ruminate to the past, which is, what's lost, and project to the future, which hasn't happened yet, which means that if you go to that wide, that's a lot of grief to carry. Whereas if we stay right here, we feel the feels, we absolutely feel the feels. But we stay here and we have the grief that is here, that is now. Then we look at what I say, the controllables. Because I feel with grief is that we sort of tend to load it all on like a cape, and then you put another one on and then another one on and then another one on. Take off the ones that are not yours and take off the ones that haven't happened yet and take off the ones that have already happened, which is where I feel that when we're living with that grief, and it's real, of course it's real. We're not saying it's not real, and I'm not saying don't pretend it's not real. We want to feel it, because once we feel it, we can then pause, we can then reflect, and then we can respond. And that's where you can walk around, you hop in the vortex, you get out, you get in, you get out. You don't stay in there, because that's where other problems develop. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And it's tough, right? It's so tough. No one's questioning that. But it's like what we both said before we hit the record button, which is about being the transparent, which we speak our truth. And I think that, you speak your truth in that it wasn't easy, but it was doable, because you're a living example of how that legacy of your grandmother comes through connection. Now, I want to ask you about the memorial wall. Tell me about this anonymous space where people can leave the name of their loved one or someone they've lost, and why is it anonymous?
So in my world of my Lord, there's a veil and it holds the world together. And the whole premise is that even when people forget, the veil still remembers. And so I wanted to create something of that nature for honoring people. And I did it a couple thoughts in mind. One of the thoughts that I had is that my mother was talking about how bad she felt not being able to make it out to the graveyard to see my grandmother. And, there was a lot going on, and, there's always in most people's life things going on. And
yeah,
I wanted to create something that allowed kind of that pressure to be at ease, kind of a space of honoring that you can see without needing to go physically there always, was one reason. It expanded also as I thought about people who may have lost others, for people who've lost children during miscarriages, or soldiers who the body may have been unrecoverable or unfound. Mm. They didn't have anything to bury. And so I wanted a space where people can honor someone to remember others, and other people can honor that memory as well. And what came to mind was a memorial wall. And this is what I created, was a smaller version of what I've envisioned. And I plan to make it where it feels more connected. Going back to that word that we talked about, connection. And you could see the names in the sky, like literally in the veil, and then see the threads connecting the different areas where people remembered names from. That's going to be the future vision. But the wall was created because there are people who have lost people, and they may have only been a single sibling, or in my grandmother's case, she outlived her other siblings. So there was this feeling of being alone because there wasn't that sibling bond to understand, how they grew up, to talk about that. And I feel like something where she could have remembered her siblings and seen other people doing that would have maybe been able to help her. Now, I chose to leave it anonymous because I feel like in moments, and I know in my moments, I was uncomfortable with being vulnerable, or even the possibility of people knowing that I was grieving. Again, like I said, I use anger to mask it. And then there are some times where you remember someone, and if somebody sees your name, there could be some kind of, they don't feel like you deserve it. So those types of things, avoid, when you're in your grief, you deserve to grieve. And not everybody agrees with that. So I felt anonymous was safer and let you really get out how you feel. Now, it is still protected. You can't just post anything. It has to be approved. I don't know who you are, but I still have to approve it. So there's not going to be anything that shouldn't be on there. But I felt like anonymous was a lot easier of a barrier for people to cross, as opposed to name and having to give a lot of information.
Yeah, I love that. And you know what? I think the biggest thing you've said there is people grieve in different ways. You initially managed your grief by not managing it through anger. And for me, when I was managing my grief and trying to hold it all together for my family, was that I was masking with the saying, you don't know how strong you are until you have no choice. And so I was this big, strong person for everyone else, and crumbling away inside, not allowing time or space to grieve, and we all do that differently. So I'm so grateful. And I think the biggest thing with grief, people can really have that understanding that gratitude and grief can coexist. You know, we can be so grateful for something that is so bad. You know, I'm so
Yes.
grateful that I get to sit here and meet cool people like you, because if it wasn't for that, and if I hadn't looked at my own grief and passing it through, I think is the really important thing, is that we open the door, we allow it in, but we open the door at the back. We don't leave it inside, because that's when it comes out with anger. For me, comes out with, Mrs. Fix It over here. Now, it's true. So what is it about grief that sometimes need a place that has no name attached to it? So tell me a little bit more about the anonymous side, and how do you feel that it supports the person who's shared it? Because the very act of sharing that on a memorial wall is quite cathartic. What's your take? I mean, have you had feedback from people, or I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yes. And honestly, interestingly enough, you kind of talked around a concept that I've started to really think about recently when you were mentioning kind of the doors in the house. And so I started really thinking about this recently, and I kind of came up with a concept that I explained with like therapists and things of the grief, the two doors of grief. And I feel like there's a I door, of course, and then there's an E door. So there's an internal and an external.
Oh, I like
And
that.
I feel like for a lot of people, we try to enter through the I door, the I am grieving, I am sad, I am mad, and even in therapy, there's a lot of times where they want you to start there. Support groups want you to start there, but not everybody is able to enter that door. Sometimes for me, it was locked. I could not bring myself to tell you I was doing anything because I just couldn't fathom saying that. And we don't really talk about how you were saying that, externalizing, to where you're taking in a moment and you're distancing yourself from that grief in a way to process it. And how you were saying you could be, have gratitude in a grieving moment. I feel that is something that allows you to process it separately. It's not internal. You're not like, I have this, I'm happy. A lot of times, normally you're looking at it from a externalization type of view of, okay, this is happening. But for me, my grandmother pushed me to graduate, because I can say I would have kept thinking I had another year and I would not have graduated on time. And me graduating on time became a catalyst, and her death became a catalyst of me going to college, getting a bachelor's, going back, getting a master's, and now I'm building a universe for other people who need it. So again, in our society, it sounds odd to say we're grateful for negative things, or I'm grateful that my grandmother passed. But sometimes those are the catalysts that we need to get across the next hurdle to really do something that grows. So that kind of helped me, again, build this wall. And while it was for me, remembrance, and it was helpful because I am at the stage where I can say the I and enter the I door. There were people who sent like thank you messages. And again, even though it's an email and I could probably find out more information, they needed it. Someone mentioned they used my memorial wall and that's what they needed that night. And that was really eye-opening. And, even if it's not 2 million, 3 million people, there was some people who could say they needed that, and they needed something that you built or that you're hosting. And that anonymous piece of it during the time made them feel safe enough to use it, as opposed to something saying, I want all this information of yours up front while in that vulnerable headspace. And that's where a lot of my focus comes in, that how can I make this easy for someone who is trying to help themselves without breaking, how can I make this the easiest for them? And that anonymous, that doesn't mean skipping safety features. I do have crisis warnings and different things. And,
yeah. That's right. And so do I. Exactly. And I think also to just point here that it takes reflection, and reflection can take time to process. So you can say the gratitude of the life your grandmother lived and the impact she had on you. But just so the listeners understand, there's trauma, right? There's no disregarding any of the trauma here. And that depending on where you are in that road is depending on how you want to, and that's the whole point here, guys, is that when we're talking about gratitude and grief, it comes in waves, but it comes in different stages. Like if you're going back to, the 24th of February, 2023, after I'd been given a second diagnosis of cancer and this one incurable, do you think that I could have even had this conversation? No. I couldn't talk to anybody. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't answer any questions because I didn't have the answers. But what it meant though is like what you've and I've, Justin, what we've done though is that with that processing, we've found the gratitude and we've found the love and respect that comes with that for ourselves and then for obviously others around us. So go us. But now I want...
It took me 18 years.
Exactly.
So
I mean, this is,
clear.
like, and I say that to people, like resilience comes with practice, but practice means repetition and consistency over time. And it's just one moment at a time, right? So let's just give ourselves grace and compassion here. So my last question here is, your practical takeaway was, don't try to process grief or let it go. In your case, you let it carve. Like water shaping stone. What has grief carved in you, which I think we've covered a little bit, but what has grief carved in you that wouldn't have existed otherwise?
Honestly, my whole body of work. This whole process came from, and I do want to say this importantly, just because, a lot of people look at trauma and grief very negatively, but everything I built has centered from this. It wasn't a plan to build a universe where mental health was a magic system, where there's a memorial wall, there's a whisper at the veil for you to release negative thoughts, where there's different features for even therapists to assist with someone who's looking at maybe going into therapy, where they can use the lore of my world to do distancing. There's a lot of things that I created, these folklore, these things where a firefighter has told me they felt witnessed and seen by something I wrote. It all came from my trauma and grief. I sat down to write a typical, fantasy for a side hustle. And it was like 4 friends, 4 swords, defeat the demon lord. Everybody goes home happy. Quick, easy money, because that's what was selling at the time. And I sat down, I started writing, and it started off 4 friends. Then the monster and the demon lords became a manifestation of grief, but they were still kind of monsters. And then they became not monsters, but just a cause and effect of the cycle of life and death being broken. And now they're just a manifestation of grief, trauma, and unprocessed emotions. And their effect on the world is just, a cause of them being. And then the characters started developing grief, mental illnesses. One of them has survivor's guilt. One has PTSD, abandonment issue. They started becoming really human really fast.
Wow, I love that. Yeah. And that's come from I think let's just name that, your openness in my world to accept what you cannot change, aka serenity, the courage to change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And leveraging, and now look where you are. You write books. You write this whole thing. Love that.
And it did.
It did, yeah. So tell our listeners, we're going to put it all in the show notes, but how can people get hold of you and find more about the work that you are doing, especially that memorial wall?
So I say the best way to get a hold of me is at VaelorinVerse.com. So VaelorinVerse. VaelorinVerse.com. And that's where all of this is housed. If you feel the weight of your job, if you feel the weight of losing someone who has, as a caregiver, who has Alzheimer's or who has dementia, there's folklores that touch on these and touch on child loss and touch on these jobs. There's a memorial wall. There's Whisper of the Veil, where you can release these negative thoughts anonymously again, and know that you're not alone, because I think that's another thing that's important, that when we get into trauma and grief, we feel like we're alone.
Yeah.
And my mentor, Natasha, she tells me we're often parallel with someone and we don't realize it. So the Whisper of the Veil is kind of that concept in real life, where it's like, there's nobody who's having any problems but me. But then you come here and you see other people release these negative thoughts. And it's like, okay, wow, this person just lost their home. They lost this. Okay. I'm not the only one going through some stuff. And it's an odd, feeling to say that when you're alone, knowing someone else is doing bad, not because you did anything, it helps you feel so not alone.
Yeah.
So VaelorinVerse.com would be the best place to find all of this. I'm also on social media at @Vaelorin. I post some of my work. The mental health campaign was something I recently posted. It was a total of 13 different voice actors that voiced each piece of an inner critic that people may have felt, self-doubt, again, vulnerability. For males, you may have felt weak or soft. In my world, Selenith is the sanctum of like foolishness. So we may have felt the ambition that we had was foolish, to start this podcast and to talk about this. You may have had that voice in your head, like, is anybody going to listen? Who would really want to talk about this negative stuff, all day? And those are the voices that, again, we talked about kind of that separating yourself. It points that out so you can understand that, again, in your case, that serenity, I can control these voices. I may not have been able to control why they started. Maybe it was somebody who said something negative to me one time. Maybe it was trauma or grief. I couldn't control that, but I can control what I do with them now. And if I choose to put them down or quit listening to them. And again, the wisdom to know the difference between those two. So all of that is on social media and at VaelorinVerse.com.
Fantastic. So we'll put all of that in the show notes, just so you know. But I want to say thank you for coming. Thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, and thank you for honoring your beautiful grandmother. She was obviously a legend, and we thank her for the gift, but more importantly, that you've chosen to take that gift she gave you and you ran with it. So thank you, and wishing you and your wife, when the twins are coming, have a wonderful time with all of that. But for our listeners, I want to say thank you for being part of our community here, because, it took me a long time to understand that connection with others is so important, because I couldn't handle my own stories, let alone anyone else's. But that passes with time, and just know that you're not alone. And so now that we're in over 27 countries, so I'm a bit excited. Serenity Rising is growing, but I want to thank you guys, our listeners. I want to thank our listeners for being a part of this story with us. And again, Justin, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been great having you here. And what I would love you to do is leave a comment or ask a question using my fan link below this episode and on every episode that we post. I would love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and I'll get back to you. Have a great day, and bye for now.